The Scrivener's Quill is a group of attorneys who love literature and have found many valuable lessons within the humanities that can apply directly to the practice of law. We decided to create a series of lectures for lawyers using the wisdom of some of the world's great authors to inspire us and to help us improve our understanding of the law and of our legal practices. We hope that you'll be both entertained and inspired by these lectures and that they will help bring a new perspective to your lives and careers.
Welcome to Literature and the Law. I'm Travis Marker. I'm the CEO of the Scrivener's Quill, and it's my pleasure to present to you what I consider a passion, what I'm very excited about, which is in essence discussing literature and the law, its application, its applicability, and its relevance to what lawyers and academics and everyone who studies the law interact with on a daily basis. Before we get into the program that you've specifically attended to watch today, where I'm going to actually do an introduction to why I think literature and the law is important and the aspects of literature and the law that I think make it relevant to everyone. When I've interacted with people across the country in conferences related to literature and the law, one of the questions that comes up, particularly from people, for example, like patent lawyers, is how is this relevant to me? And a patent lawyer works with people who are creative. A patent lawyer works with people who have ideas and inventions, and they want to know that this thing that they are calling the patent attorney about is going to provide them millions of dollars and is going to make them, wealthy. They probably can't even afford the patent attorney, but they say to the patent attorney, "Can you help me? Do I have an idea?" And the lawyer from that immediate position starts to shape the things that this individual is working with. The lawyer has an opportunity to discuss with that person what is relevant about their idea, if they actually have a unique idea, and there's a shaping process that goes into what this client will then do with that information. And that patent attorney may say, "Well, I just listen to people's problems." Well, that's not actually true, because a patent attorney, even like all attorneys, no matter what level you're at, interacts with humans, and there's a human story behind every legal problem. And those human stories are found in literature, and we're able to discuss in literature the great things that happen that allow people to connect with the law and understand the law, as well as solve their problems and the other problems that they'll be interacting with in their lives or in other people's lives. Because even when you go to a Christmas party, a Thanksgiving gathering, a social event, a soccer activity, with your kids or whatever, somebody will ultimately or eventually ask you, "I got this case," or "I got this scenario, do I have a case?" And however you respond to that scenario, "Do I have a case?" may perpetuate or propel somebody on a lot of different paths. But ultimately, you're facilitating their story. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how I got into this scenario and what literature and law means to me, and why I think you'll benefit from this program that you're watching today. So first, this came into my life. I was a double English history major from Weber State University, and I never stopped reading. Even when I went to law school, I'd often be found in the law library reading Robert Stevenson's, Treasure Island or Kidnapped, or Rob Roy by Walter Scott, or a variety of other books that may have come up. I loved literature. It helped me get through law school. It still helps me get through the practice of law. So I've been practicing about 4 years in Weber County, and there was an Inns of Court meeting in which retired Judge Gordon Lowe had a presentation that talked about lawyers as wordsmiths, and he gave a tremendous presentation, but ultimately what I heard was lawyers should read, and reading improves the practice of law. And it totally changed the way that I personally read. Some highlights from what Judge Lowe was talking about is, first, that there's not an area of the law that doesn't have its own built-in system. For example, if you're reading a parable or a maxim or a proverb, if you're looking at that specific craft or that specific writing, it doesn't qualify as a proverb, maxim, etc., unless it is written as such. So there's a law even to the format of creative writing. Poetry has a lot of different forms, but there's certain things like, a haiku, you may have a variety of different haikus, but generally if it's 17 syllables, it could be a haiku. And so I think that part of creative writing is interesting, that if it's not written as such, it isn't such, which is like the law. If you have a criminal case, what you're still doing is element-based analysis. So you say the statute represents the elements, the facts represent, applicability to those elements, and so therefore if they don't overlap, it's not the same thing. And that's the same thing with poetry and a lot of different creative expressions. When Judge Lowe got to what I thought was really interesting, he says, in law school you ultimately only learn one word, and that one word is reasonableness. Because we may learn a lot of black letter law, we may learn how to do contracts, we may learn how to do torts, personal injury, criminal law, procedures, all those things, but they're ultimately applied under a reasonableness standard. And he says what you find in great literature is reasonableness. And you find in creative writing that actually has a value that promotes some form of intellectual stimulus. There's usually a reasonableness question. For example, in Bleak House, which is, if we go to the bottom of the list here, consequences of legal decisions or bad legal decisions, is Bleak House by Charles Dickens actually a reasonable approach to the practice of law? Is that a reasonable approach to a trust and estates probate question? When you also look at books like Les Mis, he says, you can go see the play, you can go enjoy the Broadway musical, but you miss out on all the dicta and all the really amazing writing and amazing thoughts and philosophy if you haven't read, Victor Hugo's discussions about, the poor, or about government, or, he has great comments on Voltaire, as well as other authors who provide just tremendous insight into word usage and the power of words and the power of thought, and how we as lawyers can apply that to the practice of law. Another powerful idea is that all authors are advocates of something. They're not just telling us a story. They're usually trying to press upon us a thought or an opinion. Harper Lee in To Kill a Mockingbird is not talking to us about just the South or just the civil rights issues. She's cracking an entire cultural code, because at her time in the 1960s and even in the 50s in which she's placed in the book, that doesn't exist. It doesn't happen, the things she's telling you. She's telling you an ideal potential or a possibility. She's advocating for a state of affairs that does not exist at that time in the South. And so it's a very powerful book, and that's why it sells comparable sales to the Bible every year, as well as other books. It's just, To Kill a Mockingbird is so popular because of the word usage, because the author is absolutely an advocate. Another great thing about creative writing is the metaphors. Oftentimes under Rule 2.1 involving clients and attorneys and how we talk to each other, we can talk about everything that is relevant to that client's situation, including social, economic, moral, or political factors, or the whole gamut of things that may be relevant to that client's situation. Therefore, when we talk to our clients, we find out the books they're reading, the things that they enjoy, because we want to use metaphors from their lives to help teach them things that will be relevant to their legal situation. As I personally kind of took on Judge Lowe's challenge, I was astonished as I went through a lot of great literature to find out how many authors were you could read a specific author and have information specific to almost every area of law. This slide particularly represents the variety of areas of law that I've found. So we have ethics, civility, professionalism, equality and access to justice, and business, commercial, juvenile. Every area of law is found in great literature. If we look at these authors, you may look at those and you say, I may know some of them. Shakespeare's in the bottom corner. That might be kind of easy to identify or to recognize. We then have on the very top Upton Sinclair and Sinclair Lewis, who both, Upton Sinclair writes The Jungle, Sinclair Lewis writes Babbitt. Toni Morrison's on the top in the middle. Mary Shelley she writes Frankenstein. We have John Steinbeck, George Orwell, Cicero. Then on the bottom we have Langston Hughes, Victor Hugo, Alexander Dumas, and Shakespeare. So now these are all classics, and someone says, well, it's all good and well that we read the classics, but what else could we read? Well, Ray Bradbury, he's from the 1950s forward, writes some phenomenal, stories, particularly, Fahrenheit 451. Aldous Huxley has some great literature. He's also in the 1950s, 60s. A new book that is relevant to the question of evidence in criminal law is Defending Jacob. So there's not a book that I think that has value that you couldn't learn something from in almost every area of law, particularly because we interact with people on a regular basis, and we have to apply the law to people by the stories we tell them, by the way we interact with them, and the way we touch the law in everybody's lives. For example, even when you woke up and had breakfast, if you had cereal, you had a box of cereal there, and it had a Crispix on it, or it had a Fruit Loop, or it had something, and around that cereal was probably some phrase that said, this is not the actual size, this is a representation. And because somebody out there thought that when they opened up their box of Fruit Loops or their Crispix or whatever, they were going to get a gigantic Crispix. And so some lawyers said this is, unfair representation or maybe misleading. And so somebody might be in trouble if they didn't find what they were looking for in their box of cereal. But that was a lawyer engaging in the human experience through a legal process. Also on an airplane, when you see a sign that says fasten seat, on the chair in front of you, it'll say fasten your seatbelts while seated, because somebody nearly survived an airplane crash, and if they'd had that seatbelt on, maybe it would have worked out better for them when they dropped from 30,000 feet. But some lawyer said this needs to happen, this needs to be part of our preventative risk management skills, but it happens all the time. Just recently I'm watching a Nissan commercial, and it was funny because initially when this commercial came out, which showed a car jumping onto a subway train and jumping off a subway train, there was no subtitles. But as time's gone on, now it says professional driver, cars don't really jump like this, cars don't fly. So all these now subtext and subtitles are added to a commercial which hopefully somebody would have anticipated to be not real. But a lawyer got involved, most likely to prevent risk management issues and liability, and it jumps into the commerce of human interaction and human conduct on a daily basis. That's what lawyers do. And I think literature tells us more about that and more about how this could happen, and even the consequences. So even borrowing an analogy from the Bible, if we want to talk about the parable of the sower, we have the sower works with 4 types of grounds. There's the hard, stony ground that will not receive the seed. We have the thorny soil, which actually can grow the seed, but grows up in the thorns and gets choked out. Finally, we come to the 4th soil, and the 4th soil is the rich soil that is wonderful, that grows, and it creates crops that grow everywhere. And ultimately, the seed is the important thing. It's actually not the sower has very little to do with what's happening. The seed and where it's planted creates the question of what will be the life of that seed. And so even as you participate in this presentation today, the question you should ask is, what type of soil do you have for the concept of adding literature to the practice of law, to the study of law? And I hope that you'll find the presentations that you enjoy in these programs, I think they're exciting. I hope you find them exciting. I hope that you find them enjoyable. So we'll now go on to your program. One of my favorite programs that I enjoy presenting around the country, particularly as we get close to the holidays, is Ebenezer Scrooge, Public Service, and the Law of the Tithe. And I do come from a position of faith. I enjoy the discussion of religion. I enjoy discussion of the humanities in connection to philosophical thought and a lot of those different processes. But I also am amazed that sometimes when we read scripture or when we read religious writings, particularly those that are heavy with the concept of God or the relationship to God, there's ultimately some form of a canon or a code or elements very much like unto our statutes. And the law of the tithe is one of those where, unlike our state statutes or our secular statutes, if you will, that are there to prescribe conduct by way of preventative measures. So if you do the following, you've committed a crime. If you do the following, you've entered into a contract. If you do the following, you may have committed a tort. If you've done the following, you may have committed a battery or a variety of different things. Or if you've done the following, then it might be a will, right? So there's all this statute that exists to say if the following has happened or if the following exists, then you've created the following. A lot of scripture is really exciting because it'll say things that, or even like, scriptures will say things such as, if you do the following, then you get the following blessing. So it's more of a aspirational conduct or aspirational law that we still treat the same as if we were looking at law itself or the elements of law, because there's formulas, and in these formulas you can see things. And so there's actually, I like to tie this law of the tithe to public service or our pro bono efforts as lawyers. And as we talk about the pro bono efforts of lawyers, we can find in the preamble to the model rules the following. A lawyer is a representative of clients, an officer of the legal system, and a public citizen, having special responsibility for the quality of justice. A lawyer should strive to attain the highest level of skill to improve the law and the legal profession, and to exemplify the legal profession's ideals of public service. Now, if we come to this part at the end, the ideals of public service, we don't necessarily know what that means, other than there's an aspirational goal that's reflected in 6.1 relating to pro bono work, pro bono service. But as we go through the rest of the preamble, there's other allusions to it, such as a lawyer is a public citizen, as it's mentioned there. We're part of a system that ultimately reflects people's engagement with or understanding of the law or the legal system or the courts, and what we do in our private lives as well as in our public life as a lawyer reflects upon the law and the institution of the law. And so if we come here and we continue that in relation to the rule 6.1, every lawyer has a professional responsibility to provide legal services to those unable to pay. A lawyer should aspire to render at least 50 hours of pro bono legal service per year. Now, if you think about that, that's a lot of pro bono. That's a lot of public service. That's a lot of effort. And most of us probably do not take on cases that we can't do. Like, for example, most of us understand that there's a high need for public or pro bono service in the area of criminal law or family law. But some of us say, well, I don't do that type of law. Even government attorneys may say, well, I can't actually do that type of law because I'm a prosecutor. But I know that there's assistant attorney generals who will do things like wills for heroes or different things. But I also think that it's relevant that we think to ourselves, how many different ways can lawyers actually contribute to the legal profession for those unable to pay? And we provide, in essence, our IP, our mental product, which Abraham Lincoln said, you know, a lawyer's time is our stock in trade, but ultimately reflects the things that we have learned and the applications of law that we've actually studied. That's what people want from us, and there's people all the time, every day, who ask us to share that, who probably are unable to pay, or even if we ask them to pay, there would be an injustice to this. So I'm thinking of other areas of law besides just criminal and domestic where people may do pro bono work. I office next to a nonprofit entity that doesn't have the ability to pay a lawyer to advise them, so they ask a member of my office to volunteer on their board. That's pro bono service. The patent attorney who gets all the different calls, people call him or her on a regular basis saying, I got this idea. Even the lawyer taking the time to explore questions or answers with someone, and maybe they're not charging for that consultation, is providing a pro bono service, potentially for someone unable to pay who cannot afford, an elaborate patent or something of that nature. Every time we as lawyers take the time to answer questions, to facilitate someone's understanding of the law, to facilitate someone's peace of mind about the law or about their situation, we provide a pro bono service. So I don't think that we necessarily have to take on cases, particularly those that we can't do, which could create its own legal issues. You wouldn't want to take on a pro bono case just because you're supposed to if you have no idea what you're doing or if you've never practiced that type of law. You want to be able to practice law in a way that is safe, is competent, meets other model rules, but ultimately you want to say, why am I doing it, and is this perpetuating someone's peace of mind? Am I providing a public service? Because there's this comment in 6.1, there's a comment, the first comment says, every lawyer, regardless of professional prominence or professional workload, has a responsibility to provide legal service to those unable to pay. Personal involvement in the problems of the disadvantaged can be one of the most rewarding experiences in the life of an attorney. And I think I found that to be true in my private practice. In lieu of legal fees, sometimes I've received apple butter, and sometimes it's like the sweetest apple butter you could receive because that person can't pay you. They want to give you something for what's happened. And it's just a show of gratitude. And on your side, on my side, it was very rewarding, very exciting to just see that person's gratefulness for what I'd done for them, but also so I could share in their peace of mind and the things which they're enjoying. I also have another friend, who he probably has the ability to pay, but I didn't have the ability to pay for a service that he provided me. He was a very competent tradesman, works with tile, and he came in. We were in the process of doing some things to our house, and he just did a phenomenal, miraculous job, and in a short time, just so competent. And he did it because he just loves my kids, and he's in that category where my kids are somewhat like his grandkids. We were at his swimming pool quite often. We were doing lots of things with his family. And just out of the goodness of his heart, he did things for my family that I couldn't afford to pay him for at that particular time. And then it came up, quite a few months later. He has a scenario with his son who's getting a divorce. And I couldn't charge him. I mean, we'd already had a trade. We'd already had done something where he'd provided my family value. And I think sometimes that stuff comes into it where it was wonderful for me to be able to finally serve him and to finally be able to do something for his family when he was in stress. He would not have wanted to pay, the attorney's fees for his son's divorce, which were, in my mind, they far exceeded, they would be far more expensive than his service to my family for the trade that he provided in doing some, construction stuff. But for both of us, they were of high value. They were exciting. We both felt rewarded. It made us feel closer as friends. There was more of a bond. And I think that that's what we provide in legal services. We have bonds with so many people because we've served them, and we didn't charge them every single dollar for everything we did. And I think that's what improves the ideals of the profession, improves the practice of law, is when we're able to interact with people and help them feel better about the legal system and the legal process because we were able to contribute to them and for them. So this next slide relates to, this is George Handy. George Handy was an attorney, and I think he's now in his 90s. About 6 years ago, he wrote a letter to the editor, and in this letter to the editor, he was combating a mediator, a former attorney who's now a mediator, who said that basically the practice of law had become corrupt. It did not facilitate resolutions or peaceful processes, and basically the law was a corrupt system. And George Handy is one of these individuals who's been a lawyer a long time, was proud of the practice of law, was grateful for the things that the law and the legal system had done for him, and that he could be a part of that as a lawyer. And so he wrote this letter to the editor. I was practicing law about 4 years at this point, and I read it and I thought it was great stuff. And so that's why I'm including it in this program. He says, "I've been a lawyer for almost 60 years and have seen great changes happen to a noble profession, some of them good and some of them bad. It has grieved me to see the role of the lawyer change from that of a professional to a businessman. When I began my practice, lawyers did not make money. I'm not certain that they intended to. Their motivation was to serve the public, to right wrongs, to represent the defenseless, and hopefully to make the world a better place to live for their having been there. If a lawyer truly understands his profession, he has every right to hold his head high. He should be one of the most honored and appreciated persons in his community because he stands between civilization, chaos, and oppression. Who else will you go to if you are deprived of your constitutional rights? Who else will you go to if you are wrongfully accused? Who else will you go to if you have been wronged? Who else will you go to share or lift the burden you cannot bear?" And what I found about this that was so exciting was that this was real. Like, these are the people who come to us, particularly in my areas of law, which are kind of the blue-collar areas of law, criminal, family, domestic, juvenile. Even, I don't do bankruptcies, but that's another area of law where most of the areas of law that people come to us, it's not in the leisure services or in the luxuries. If you're a litigator, normally you're litigating things that are causing people stress or strife, that a business partner has taken the money, therefore their friendship is gone. They've been sharing family dinners together forever, and now they realize that one of them's embezzling and everything's gone bad. People come to us then. They don't come to us when everything is generally peaceful, unless you practice trust in estates and there's like a surplus of money because the market hasn't crashed recently. which it has. So that's why people are still coming to us, is because they're trying to figure out their legal solutions, their legal, the legal problems that they have. They want us to bear their burdens, and I think it's a perspective or an ideal that the bar is trying to have us accomplish. They want us to be people who are serving others and are bringing people to a place of peace in connection with their legal problems. So when we come to A Christmas Carol, I think this is a phenomenal story that I think reaches into all these areas of law, and particularly into the human relations that we enjoy with other people. It's a Christmas classic that's been around forever. It's just totally exciting, but it also holds the two, I think, metaphysical laws. Whether you believe in God or not, in essence, it deals with metaphysical laws, or you wouldn't have three ghosts showing up to invite Ebenezer Scrooge to become a better person. So first, if we go to Malachi, this is chapter 3, verses 8 through 12, and I'm borrowing the King James Version. Will a man rob God? Ye have robbed me, but you say, wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings. Ye are cursed with a curse, for ye have robbed me, even this whole nation. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house. And prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. And I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground. Neither shall your vine cast her fruit before the time in the field, saith the Lord of hosts. And all nations shall call you blessed, for ye shall be a delightsome land, saith the Lord of hosts. Now, I come from a tradition where this is actually very important scripture, and it's very much a part of our code. And it asks some questions that I think are interesting, because most of us, we would like to have blessings that were so numerous that the windows of heaven, would open up and there wouldn't be enough room to receive it. But as I started my own practice 10 years ago, I just wanted the devourer to leave me alone. I needed paychecks to come in. I needed things not to break down. I needed things to go well. And the majority of our clients, the majority of the people who come to us for legal solutions or for legal problem solving, they want the devourer to give them a break, because in essence, divorce is the devourer, bankruptcy is the devourer, death is the devourer. There's so many things in our clients' lives that are that devourer, and they want even us as lawyers to help rebuke that process. And so you say, well, what are we doing as lawyers, in essence, to even contribute to paying our tithes? And that's part of that public service or that pro bono work. But here we have Jacob Marley is visiting with Ebenezer Scrooge. And in this conversation, Scrooge is trying to reconcile that, things aren't so bad, that it's actually not quite so weird that a ghost is standing before him with chains and bank boxes. And so he says to Jacob, he says, but you were a good man of business, Jacob, faltered Scrooge, who began to apply this to himself. And then the ghost freaks out. Business, cried the ghost, wringing his hands again. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. And if we look at these two thoughts, what we have ultimately is, the two great commandments, right? Love God and love your neighbor. And I come from the Mormon tradition, so I'll throw in here from Mosiah. When you're in the service of your fellow beings, you're only in the service of your God. I also just recently read a quote from G.K. Chesterton, who said, when he feels that he's actually touched individuals' lives, then he feels the blessing of God in his soul. And so that's more from the Catholic philosophy, the Catholic tradition, but it's really irrelevant because it's in everybody's system. I even laughed at Kurt Vonnegut, a very known and enjoyable pessimist, but also humanist, and a declared nearly atheist. He says, being a humanist means trying to behave decently without expectation of reward or punishment after you are dead. A purpose of human life, no matter who is controlling it, is to love whoever's around, to be loved. And that's absolutely true. So, whatever your system of belief is, whether it believes in God or not, the absolute relevance of Rule 6.1 and doing public service is that, there's a human system that basically propels us towards each other and propels us towards doing good. And I think that's found in the old Asiatic idea of karma. The sum of a person's action is this, and previous states of existence viewed as deciding their fate in future existences. So no matter where you're at, the reality is that the universe is going to be grateful if you provide public service. Specific to this situation with Ebenezer Scrooge, I think he lines up perfectly with the scripture from Malachi, because the question is, has he robbed God? Well, obviously he probably has robbed God, because there wouldn't be three ghosts that are going to appear to him. I guess fourth if you count Jacob Marley. He's clearly cursed, and this is his last chance to cure. He's got the chains, he's got the boxes. He's in a bad shape, or this story wouldn't exist. So the question is he going to start to pay his tithe or to redeem himself? And in this situation, it's his money, but it's also his love that he should have towards his nephew. It's also the connection he should have to his local bar association, in essence. What is he going to do? Because if he doesn't do it, then the third ghost is the devourer, who is there to rebuke him. And at this point, it's almost too late, so he's going to be destroyed if he doesn't figure it out. Well, at the end, he does accept the challenge. He does accept what's happening to him, and he becomes blessed. So I think it's absolutely fascinating how Ebenezer Scrooge overlaps just so clearly with the law that I've found in Malachi. The great thing about this story also, from the point of history, is that Charles Dickens at one point was a law clerk. And the funny thing is, most of his stories, the law clerks are good and the attorneys are bad, which is interesting and funny at the same time. But it also relates in this story. There's been some scholars of the Dickens material who have speculated that Ebenezer Scrooge was actually a solicitor who was involved in the collection and exchange of money or lending, and wasn't just a banker, but was actually potentially a solicitor, because that would have been more consistent with Charles Dickens. He always includes lawyers in his writing, and they usually always show up, so it makes sense that Ebenezer Scrooge would show up as a lawyer. I think that we have two very instructive individuals who represent the blessed at the beginning of the book. We have the solicitors for charity. We also have his nephew. And his nephew is, he's happy and he's positive regardless of the fact that Ebenezer Scrooge is his uncle, who never sees him. His own mother's died, so he has plenty of reasons to be upset. He has plenty of reasons to not be happy, and yet his nephew is excited. He wants to bless his uncle. He wants to do great things for no other reason than just he's an individual who's engaged in, a public service, not necessarily of charity, but just of happiness. The solicitor of charities make this comment that I think is instructive to go through in the story. They show up at the door and they begin. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years," Scrooge replied. "He died 7 years ago this very night." "We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner," said the gentleman, presenting his credentials. It certainly was, for they had been two kindred spirits. At the ominous word liberality, Scrooge frowned and shook his head and handed the credentials back. "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, taking up a pen, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir." "Are there no prisons?" asked Scrooge. "Plenty of prisons," said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. "And the Union workhouses?" demanded Scrooge. "Are they still in operation?" "They are still," returned the gentleman. "I wish I could say that they were not." "The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigor, then?" said Scrooge. "Both very busy, sir." "Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their usual course," said Scrooge. "I'm very glad to hear it." Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude," returned the gentleman, "a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is the time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?" "Nothing," Scrooge replied. "You wish to be anonymous?" "I wish to be left alone," said Scrooge. "Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I hope to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die. If they would rather die, said Scrooge, then they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that. But you might know it, observed the gentleman. It's not my business, Scrooge returned. It's enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen. And this is I love this section of verse. I find it just totally fascinating. But it also represents so many of the current philosophies that exist. I was just reading one author, John Franson, in his book, The Discomfort Zone, was making a comment about how he pays for the government, and when he pays the government, he's hoping that the following will happen by way of public service or public help or assistance. Specifically, he was talking at that point about the Hurricane Katrina, and he was concerned that he had to give more money to a charity or a church at that point because the church was picking up the slack of the government. And he wasn't saying he didn't do it or he didn't mind doing it, but in his mind he was paying to the government what he considered to be a tithe. And so he was hoping that his offerings to the government would be enough to pay for these different things. He was also a lot more liberal than Scrooge would have been about the poor law and things of that nature. But it's very similar to what you hear. I paid my bar dues, and my bar dues should be covering legal aid, or my bar dues should be covering the following, or I did this, and this should be enough. The question is that is there ever enough, or have we just ever paid our total dues? I think as lawyers, and particularly as public citizens who are lawyers, I think we have to have our visions open to the fact that there are many ways that we can serve. There's many ways that we can contribute, and they're going to go beyond just our bar dues. They're going to go beyond just our taxes. They're going to go beyond some of our basic contributions. I think we have to be looking at our role, and this may be totally ideal, and there may be somebody watching this saying, this guy is totally full of it. And I'm totally into that, but I really do believe in the idealistic perspective that lawyers truly add something to society more than any other profession. Doctors heal people physically, but lawyers can solve problems. And I think there's so many ways that as these solicitors of charity are inviting lawyers, particularly Scrooge, to participate, they're inviting us to also participate, to be conscious of what could be happening in our societies and ways that we could pay our tithe or our public service towards the betterment of society. Well, as the story progresses, we have Marley who shows up, and I love some of these slides. This one that shows his chin dropping, as I read that story, I just thought that was such a phenomenal image because his chin just literally drops to his jaw, and it was really just descriptive writing, and so I really enjoyed reading it. But what's really haunting about this scene is that after Jacob has visited with Scrooge, the windows open and he goes out into the night. And all you see in this story is people who are trying to do their best by society, but they're ghosts and they have no physical bodies. They don't have the ability to engage with individuals. And one of the most poignant images that you see that is just below Scrooge's window on the street is a banker who is kneeling at the feet of a mother, and this mother's trying to comfort her child. The mother's doing the best she can, the child's wailing, but more particularly the banker is struggling. The banker is in essence weeping and wailing himself because he cannot provide any relief to this mother. And I'm pretty sure that as you look in your life and you just kind of look in those forgotten places where you haven't been seeing things, there's going to be people that you recognize you wish you could have done something. And you're putting it on your list right now maybe. Who could I touch today, or who could I just shoot that email to, or maybe I could make a brief phone call, or maybe I could go to lunch with the following, because all those are little touches of tender mercies or touches of graces that will help lift people. And that's how you get rid of your chains and your bank boxes, right? And that's what when you open this window and you go down and you're looking into this ether and the night sky full of people just that are miserable, I think we have to say to ourselves, who could I maybe lift the burden for a little bit today? We next go to the first spirit. And the great thing about this spirit is that she's showing Scrooge a time in his life when he's blessed. So it's a time when he's consistent regardless of the things that he's suffered. He's consistent with the law of the tithe. He's doing his best. Even though his father, for whatever reason, doesn't like him, his sister shows up and says, hey, you can come home now, Father likes you again, or something of that nature. I mean, it's fairly incomprehensible, but when you read Charles Dickens, like, that's what every boy goes through. And so it's one of those examples of how just life is never good in Charles Dickens' books for kids. In this story, particularly with Charles Dickens, it's the same case. But the interesting thing is we've just met this horrible, rough, hard-hearted person. And as soon as he sees this place, he begins to weep. And the Spirit identifies him as his weeping. And so he goes to the school where he's reading the books. He can't wait to think about, Robinson Crusoe and all the things that he enjoyed in this school. His sister comes. His sister reminds him of his modern day nephew, Fred, that he's abandoned. But his sister loved him so much, and ultimately she dies in birth. He doesn't, we're not to that part of the vision yet, but then we have Fezziwig. And Fezziwig is the archetypical example of the modern, aspiration for the businessman who's a public servant, who's doing his best by his employees, who's making people happy. Everywhere Fezziwig goes, life is better, life is good, and things are amazing. And Scrooge even defends him when the ghost says, was he a good man of business? I mean, look, this is how he's wasting all this money on people for Christmas. And Scrooge comes to his defense. Scrooge is also, even at this point, so charitable and so open to the possibilities of newness of life that he falls in love. He ultimately, finds a different God to replace the beauty of this woman that he loves, and that's one of the sad scenes, which then takes us to the second ghost, to the second spirit, and this is where we find out all the things where we're learning more about Scrooge's business. And in this business, he discovers that his Bob Cratchit's family is actually destitute, just barely making it by, which is something he hadn't made his business before. He hadn't worried about. He finds out that Tiny Tim is a cripple who will die if he doesn't receive more assistance from Ebenezer Scrooge by way of income and finance. He looks at his nephew Fred, who he loves. Well, actually, he loved his mother, and now we have this void because basically nobody's left for Fred, but Fred is still happy, he's still enjoyable, he's still doing all these great things. But it's also a vacancy that, as his surviving uncle and his surviving relative, Ebenezer Scrooge should be present. He should be more accessible to his nephew. And so Scrooge is learning all these great things about, in essence, his business. But the question is he actually doing anything technically wrong? I mean, if your employees come in and they're willing to work for $8 an hour or $7 an hour, but they're doing $15 an hour work, or you're billing them, your paralegal is doing such and such, and you bill her at 5 or 6 times the value, but you don't really give her bonuses, or him bonuses. You're not recognizing their efforts. In essence, you're in that same category as where it's good business that you charge people the least amount of money possible, pay them, etc., or you charge them the most possible, pay your help staff the least possible. Is it good ultimate business? Is it good business that you'd want to have as part of the system and the way you're doing things? Clearly, Charles Dickens is challenging us to say no, that you have a greater obligation to the business community, to your clients, also to your help, the people that are working with you, and even to your own family, that you need to be participating in. And this is one of the scariest parts in the show. When I was growing up as a kid, I was always afraid of this part where the ghost would unleash the people that were, the kids that were in his skirts. But this is what he says. Scrooge identifies there's something inside his cloak. "Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe. "But I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?" "It might be a claw, for the flesh there is upon it," was the spirit's sorrowful reply. "Look here." From the foldings of its robe, it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garment. "Oh man, look here, look down here," exclaimed the ghost. There was a boy and a girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility. where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints, a stale and shriveled hand like that of age had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacing. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade through all the mysteries of wonderful creation has monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge started back appalled. Having them shown to him this way, he tried to say they were fine children, but the words choked themselves rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude. Spirit, are they yours? Scrooge could say no more. They are man's, said the Spirit, looking down upon them, and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both and all of their decree. But most of all beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased. Deny it, cried the Spirit, stretching out his hand toward the city. Slander those who tell it ye, admit it for your factious purposes, and make it worse than abide the day. Have they no refuge or resource, cried Scrooge. Are there no prisons, said the Spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. Are there no workhouses? Now this is a totally great part of the story because it's bringing it back to Scrooge, throwing it in his face, because now he's kind of crossed over to a variety of places in his own mind in which he realizes he could do a better job. And for him to actually seek out a plea to mercy or grace was very unlike the Scrooge at the beginning of the story. But Charles Dickens in this part of the story is also arguing to society, because at this point in the Industrial Revolution, the majority of children died before 10. So most of them were going to the union workhouses, they were going to the steel mills, they were going to the industrial warehouses, and they were dying. And they weren't going to school, and so you had this potential perpetuation of ignorance throughout society, and in essence, society goes where the children go. And so he's saying, we're not educating our children, they're dying. I mean, all these things are happening, but then there's also the other ignorance, just that I did pay my dues, I did pay my taxes, I did pay for the poorhouse. I don't want to know what's not happening. I don't want to know about the gap that's not being filled. I don't want to know that there are poor and starving all around me. Even it's somewhat interesting is that we anticipate the poor live in another country. They don't live in our country, because that would mean we have to take care of them. That means if the poor, even in my own town, they need food or shelter or clothing, I don't want to see that. I want to worry about it in another country. I want to pay my nonprofit somewhere, and it'll just do a good job. Well, I think there's an obligation to see what is around us, what's surrounding us, and what are the ways in which us, even as lawyers, can tap into that opportunity to serve and tap into the problems that are everywhere that need to be addressed. Not that we have to be everywhere, not that we have to be everyone or be everything, but I think there has to be a consciousness of opportunities to serve and consciousness of the problems that surround us. So as we progress to the next spirit, ultimately Scrooge is dumbfounded that this person that is being talked about, that is not being shown, has no one that seems to care that this individual has died. He's just seen a vision in which not a vision. He's just been at the pawn shop in which somebody's clothes are all being, just cost off. All the silverware, the bed hangings, and nobody seems to care that nobody seems to care that this individual in the story has died. There's no remorse. Nothing is happening. And so Scrooge says to the ghost, "Can you not show me anyone who has any sorrow or remorse or cares at all that this person has died?" And then we're brought here to a little dialogue about his clients. "If there is any person in the town who feels emotion caused by this man's death," said Scrooge, quite agonized, "show that person to me. Spirit, I beseech you." The phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment like a wing, and withdrawing it, revealed a room by daylight, where a mother and her child were. She was expecting someone, and with anxious eagerness, for she walked up and down the room, started at every sound, looked out from the window, glanced at the clock, tried, but in vain, to work with her needle, and could hardly bear the voices of the children in their play. At length, the long-expected knock was heard. She hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed, though he was young. There was a remarkable expression in it now, a kind of serious delight of which he felt ashamed and which he struggled to repress. He sat down to the dinner that had been boarding for him by the fire, and where she asked him faintly, "What news?" which was not until after a long silence. He appeared embarrassed how to answer. "Is it bad, or is it good," she said, "or bad to help him?" "Bad," he answered. "We are quite ruined," she responded. "No, there is hope, Caroline." "If he relents," she said, amazed. "There is. Nothing is past hope if such a miracle has happened." "He is past relenting," said her husband. "He is dead." She was a mild and patient creature if her face spoke truth, but she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so with clasped hands. She prayed for forgiveness the next moment and was sorry, but the first was the emotion of her heart. "What the half-drunken woman whom I told you of last night said to me when I tried to see him and obtained a week's delay, and what I thought was a mere excuse to avoid me, turns out to have been quite true. He was not only very ill, but dying then." "To whom will our debt be transferred?" "I don't know, but before that time we shall be ready with the money, and even though we were not, it would be a bad fortune indeed to find a merciless, a creditor in his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline." Yes, softened it as they would, their hearts were lighter. The children's faces, hushed and clustered around to hear what they so little understood, were brighter, and it was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion that the ghost could show him caused by the event was one of pleasure. And I think this is totally fascinating, because I think in my own life, I'm anticipating there's not very many clients that would actually be relieved if I died. But I would hate to know that there were. I would hate to know that I provided such a lack of public service or customer service or personal service to my clients that if one of my clients died, or if I died, people would, have little regard for that scenario. So I think this is one of those, because most of the time we think of Ebenezer Scrooge worrying about his grave or worrying about whatever, but then after this scene we know he's taken to the Cratchit home, where the Cratchits, they're all distraught and they're crying and they're frustrated and they're depressed because Tiny Tim has actually died. And they're worried about their father, Bob Cratchit, who used to run so quickly with Tim on his shoulders, who used to, enjoy going to church and sitting with Tiny Tim or seeing Tiny Tim. And we see in Tiny Tim, true remorse, true grieving, true sorrow for his passing, where in Scrooge we actually see relief. And I think that's it's a great reminder for us as professionals. Well, we know that, Scrooge wakes up the next day and he's totally excited. He's redeemed because he's not dead. And it's also still Christmas, and the spirits were able to get it done in one day. And he says, "I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach." So, it's very powerful, very enjoyable image, and very, powerful idea. And, how do we live all of our lives? How do we have the spirits of all three? Again, we have this person on the video who's saying, this guy's totally idealistic. I can't wait for it to end. But I hope you will accept the challenge. I mean, to truly ask, are you just getting some CLD credit today, or are you really engaged in this process? And wonder, how are you doing? How are you engaged in your society? How are you engaged with your individuals? Because when we do, we truly do become blessed. The devourer absolutely does, stay out of our lives. But I also think it crosses over into, literature. Some of this is a little bit gimmicky, but it's all, as we relate to money. I think it's interesting that most millionaires have some concept of the tithe or some concept of public service or public offering. And so I pulled some of these connections from some other works. This is Rich Dad, Poor Dad, who grew up in Hawaii. You had a poor dad who was a philosopher, academic, an educator. His rich dad's an entrepreneur, businessman, and he learns lessons from both dads. The one that he learns two specific to his from his rich dad about giving. "My rich dad taught me a lesson. I have carried it throughout my life. And that was the necessity of being charitable and giving. My rich dad gave me money as well as education. He believed firmly in tithing. If you want something, you first need to give, he would always say. When he was short of money, he simply gave money to his church or favorite charity. And I find this to be a crossover principle you see in a lot of literature relating to wealth. Particularly in this book by The Millionaire Mind with Thomas Stanley, the PhD, this is a non-fictional work in which he's doing a study of a great portion of a great population of millionaires. And in this study, he specifically addresses charitable giving. He says there is no more noble lifestyle activity than raising funds for charity. Note that nearly 2/3 of the millionaires, 64%, engaged in this activity in the past 12 months. And there was a very strong positive correlation between this activity and net worth. I noticed that 64% isn't 100%, which means that there are still individuals who make money and they don't necessarily give or participate in charitable activities. But I think it's, as you reflect this second comment here, it says, good deeds do get rewarded even here on earth. Financially successful people and the next generation of economically productive people volunteer. And so you can see that there's a mental correlation there's a financial responsibility in correlation to volunteering and to donating and to engaging in charitable causes. That also correlates to economically productive people. This one here with Tithe Harv Eckert, he's definitely more in the salesman category. But I think he has a lot of really interesting and creative little maxims on wealth and what the poor do versus what the rich do. But one of these that I think is very consistent with maybe a more conservative Christian-based perspective in which money could potentially represent the root of all evil, which is not actually what the scripture is saying. It's in relation to the love of money, but I'm not trying to justify it. I'm just going to identify here that I think this is the key point. Money is power, and you ought to be reasonably ambitious to have it. You ought, because you can do more good with it than you can without it. Money printed your Bibles, money builds your churches, money sends your missionaries, and money pays your preachers. I say then, you ought to have money. If you can honestly attain unto riches, it is your godly duty to do so. It is an awful mistake of these pious people to think you must be awfully poor in order to be pious. Now, I think this is really a crossover principle that you see in a lot of great literature. For example, in Les Mis, when Jean Valjean is purchased by the Bishop of D, he's told, I purchase your soul with these candlesticks. And then Jean Valjean goes to another town and builds a candlestick making place, or corporation, and with that money he feeds hundreds of women who are destitute and poor because they have jobs, and lots of people, not just women. But it's an example of, if you have a good purpose in your heart, if you're trying to serve the universe, if you're trying to do good by your money, and you honestly attain it, so you're looking at the perspective of your business practices, of your business model, and you say, I provide a reasonable service to people at a reasonable price, and I'm doing this to make things better. I'm not creating a structure that just generates money or it's just a money mill, but you're really saying, I'm trying to achieve a good public service with the way I practice, with the way I engage with people. You will do great things, and in essence, you're going to be blessed. The devourer is rebuked for your sake. You move on, your practice moves on, and good things continue to happen for you. So the question that you want to ask yourself in your practice is, have you robbed God, or robbed the universe, or robbed your fellow men, or whatever? If you're in the Kurt Vonnegut category, do you rob the people who are just standing around you and you're not reaching out to them? Because is mankind, or is the humankind, your business? Because if it's not the windows of heaven, definitely the universe or karma, reflects good things. It comes around, it connects with you, and the devourer is rebuked for your sake. And I'd say all nations, or even your general bar association, or your family and friends, you recognize who are blessed people. There's people who are delightsome. There are people you want to be around. And usually these people are out there doing good, and they're engaged in these public services. So with that, we've reached the end of the presentation. I've hoped you had a great time. You'll now be invited to participate in that evaluation process. Thank you.